There are some heroes who never claim the title, who save hundreds of lives and then disappear into normal existence, who carry the weight of impossible choices in silence, because talking about saving 300 people means also talking about the ones you couldn't save. What happened when 44-year-old Sarah Thompson walked onto the Family Feud stage with her brother's family, looking like any other middle-aged woman in business casual attire, was the accidental revelation of what she'd done on September 11, 2001, at the World Trade Center's Marriott Hotel, where she'd been a front desk supervisor who'd evacuated every single guest from the building before the towers fell, going back inside 7 times to search for stragglers while everyone else was running away, saving approximately 300 lives while watching thousands of others die around her. She stood there trying to smile, trying to participate in a game show her niece had begged her to do, never intending to mention the worst day of human history. But when Steve Harvey asked a seemingly innocent Family Feud question about acts of courage and Sarah gave an answer that made the entire room go silent, the truth she'd been hiding for 23 years would come spilling out. If you've ever saved lives but carried guilt about the ones you couldn't save, if you've ever been called a hero when you feel like a failure, if you've ever hidden your trauma because people's gratitude feels like an accusation, you need to hear what this woman revealed. Before we begin, if you believe that survivors carry burdens the rest of us can't imagine, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because we share stories about people who did extraordinary things and then spent decades trying to forget. Sarah Thompson was born in 1980 in Newark, New Jersey, to working-class parents who both worked in the hospitality industry. Her mother was a hotel housekeeper, her father worked in hotel maintenance, and Sarah grew up understanding that taking care of guests, making people feel safe and welcomed, was honorable work. She started working at the Marriott World Trade Center in 1998, right after graduating from Rutgers with a hospitality management degree. At 21 years old, Sarah was the youngest front desk supervisor the hotel had ever hired, responsible for managing the front desk staff, handling guest complaints, coordinating with housekeeping and maintenance, ensuring that the 940-room hotel ran smoothly. She loved the job, loved the fast pace of working at a major Manhattan hotel, loved the diverse international clientele, loved being 21 years old in New York City with her whole life ahead of her. On September 10, 2001, Sarah worked the evening shift 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. handling check-ins and dealing with the usual chaos of a nearly full hotel. The occupancy that night was around 75%, approximately 700 guests plus staff. Sarah went home to her apartment in Jersey City around midnight, exhausted but satisfied, planning to work the early shift the next day, 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. September 11, 2001 started as a perfect late summer morning, clear blue skies, temperatures in the low 70s, the kind of day that made you grateful to be alive in New York. Sarah arrived at the hotel at 6:45 a.m., grabbed coffee, started preparing for her shift. At 8:46 a.m., as Sarah was reviewing the day's check-outs and arrivals, there was a massive explosion from above, the entire building shaking violently. Sarah's first thought was earthquake, but earthquakes didn't sound like that, didn't feel like that. Within seconds, debris started falling past the windows, and people were screaming, and the fire alarm was going off, and Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She ran to the front desk, grabbed the PA microphone, and made an announcement. "Attention all guests, we are evacuating the hotel immediately. Please proceed calmly to the nearest stairwell and exit the building. Do not use elevators. Hotel staff will assist you." The hotel's emergency protocols were clear. In the event of an evacuation, front desk staff were to direct guests to exits, ensure orderly evacuation, and be the last ones out. Sarah started directing guests toward the stairwells, maintaining calm even though inside she was terrified, not knowing what had happened, whether the hotel itself was on fire, whether they were safe. Within minutes, word spread that a plane had hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center directly above them. The Marriott was located at the base of the towers, essentially in their shadow, connected to the complex. If the towers were compromised, the hotel was in catastrophic danger. Sarah and her staff worked frantically to evacuate guests, going floor by floor when they could access them, pounding on doors, yelling for people to get out. Many guests were already fleeing, but some were confused, Some were elderly and moving slowly, some were disabled and needed assistance. Some were foreign tourists who didn't speak English and didn't understand the urgency. Sarah helped an elderly woman in a wheelchair down 6 flights of stairs, her arms screaming with effort. She went back up and found a deaf couple who hadn't heard the alarm, communicated through gestures that they needed to leave NOW. She encountered a mother with 3 small children who was panicking, and Sarah physically carried one of the children while directing the mother and others down the stairs. The stairwells were becoming crowded with people from the towers also evacuating, and the crush of humanity trying to escape was overwhelming, but Sarah kept moving, kept directing, kept helping. At 9:03 a.m., as Sarah was on the 4th floor helping evacuate guests, the second plane hit the South Tower. The building shook again, worse this time, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't an accident. This was an attack, and they were all in mortal danger. She made it down to the lobby, where most of the hotel staff had already evacuated, and she started to leave, started to run toward the exit like every survival instinct was screaming at her to do. But then she looked at the guest registry, the list of rooms that had been occupied that morning, and she realized she didn't know if everyone was out. There could still be people in their rooms, people who'd slept through the alarm, people who were injured, people who were hiding in bathrooms scared to come out. And Sarah made a decision that should have killed her. She went back inside. She ran back into the hotel, back up the stairs, while everyone else was running out, and she started searching rooms. She had a master key, and she went floor by floor, opening every single room, checking bathrooms and closets, yelling for anyone who might still be there. Most rooms were empty, abandoned, guests having fled, but on the 5th floor, she found an elderly man who'd had a stroke, lying on the bathroom floor, conscious but unable to move or speak. Sarah grabbed him under his arms and dragged him to the hallway. Then firemen carried him down 5 flights of stairs, a 180-pound man on her 135-pound frame, her body screaming in agony but pushing through. She got him outside, handed him to paramedics, and immediately went back in. By now, firefighters and police were arriving, and they were yelling at her to get out, that the building wasn't safe, but Sarah ignored them. There were still names on her list, still rooms she hadn't checked. She went back up to the 7th floor, found a family of 4 who'd barricaded themselves in their room out of fear, and she convinced them to follow her down. She went back up to the 9th floor, found 2 businessmen who'd been in the shower when the alarm went off and didn't understand what was happening. She escorted them down. Each trip up took longer because the smoke was getting worse, the heat was intensifying, the structure was making sounds that suggested catastrophic failure was imminent. After her 4th trip up, a fire captain physically blocked her from going back in, said the building was going to collapse, that she'd already saved dozens of people but needed to save herself now. Sarah tried to push past him, said there were still people inside, still names on her list. The captain grabbed her arms and said, "You've done everything you could. You need to evacuate now or you're going to die." At 9:59 a.m., as the captain was physically pulling Sarah away from the hotel entrance, the South Tower collapsed. The sound was like nothing Sarah had ever heard, a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, and then a massive cloud of debris and dust and horror was rushing toward them like a tsunami. The fire captain threw Sarah behind a fire truck and covered her body with his own as the debris cloud engulfed them. For several minutes, Sarah couldn't see, couldn't breathe, couldn't hear anything except the apocalyptic sound of a 110-story building ceasing to exist. When the dust settled enough to see, Sarah looked up and the South Tower was just gone, replaced by a smoking crater and a debris field that looked like the end of the world. The hotel, her hotel where she'd worked for 3 years, was partially collapsed, crushed by debris from the tower. If Sarah had still been inside, if she'd made that 5th trip up that the fire captain had prevented, she'd be dead. Sarah stood there covered in dust, looking like a ghost, and all she could think was, did I get everyone out? Were there still people inside when the tower fell? The fire captain, who'd saved her life by preventing her from going back in, asked her name, and when Sarah told him, he said, "Sarah, how many people do you think you evacuated?" Sarah, in shock, said, "I don't know." All the guests. As many as I could, the captain said. The hotel had around 700 guests last night. We've been accounting for survivors and so far we've documented over 300 hotel guests who got out. Most of them are saying a front desk supervisor named Sarah kept going back in to evacuate them, that you personally helped dozens of people get out. You saved them. You're a hero. But Sarah didn't feel like a hero. She felt like she'd failed because there were still 400 rooms she hadn't checked, still people she hadn't accounted for, and even though she logically understood that many guests had evacuated early and many rooms had been empty, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd left people behind. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed, and what remained of the Marriott was completely destroyed, crushed under 220,000 tons of steel and concrete. Anyone who'd still been in the hotel was dead. Sarah spent the rest of September 11th and the days following giving statements to authorities, helping account for hotel guests and staff, trying to piece together who'd survived and who hadn't. The final accounting showed that approximately 330 hotel guests had survived, evacuating before the towers fell. About 40 guests and staff members died, either because they'd evacuated into the towers and got trapped, or because they'd been in the hotel when it collapsed. Sarah learned the names of every person who died, memorized them, carried them like stones in her chest. Hotel staff told authorities that Sarah had personally evacuated over 100 people, had made multiple trips back into the building, had risked her life repeatedly while everyone else was fleeing. The hotel management, what remained of it, called Sarah a hero, said she'd single-handedly saved more lives than anyone else that day except maybe the first responders, but Sarah couldn't accept that label. She'd saved 300 people but 40 had died. She'd gone back inside 7 times, but maybe if she'd gone back an 8th time she could have saved one more person. The fire captain had stopped her from making that 5th trip after she'd already brought people down 4 times, and maybe if she'd fought harder, insisted more forcefully, she could have saved more. The survivors she'd helped reached out to thank her, sent letters and emails and calls, saying she'd saved their lives. They owed her everything. But every thank you felt like an indictment because it reminded her of the people she hadn't saved. Sarah developed severe PTSD, nightmares every night about being back in the hotel, searching rooms, hearing people calling for help that she couldn't reach. She couldn't sleep without medication, couldn't work in hotels anymore because the smell of the building, the sound of alarms, the layout of rooms, all triggered panic attacks. She went through years of therapy, was diagnosed with survivor's guilt, was told repeatedly that she'd done everything humanly possible, that no one could have saved everyone, that she should be proud of the 300 lives she'd saved. But Sarah couldn't feel proud, could only feel the weight of 40 deaths she thought she might have prevented if she'd been faster, smarter, braver. She never talked about 9/11 publicly, declined media interviews, refused to attend memorial ceremonies where survivors wanted to honor her, changed careers entirely, and became a medical billing specialist, a job with no public interaction where she could hide in a cubicle and not think about the day she'd become a hero by failing to save everyone. She married in 2005, had 2 children in 2008 and 2011, built a quiet suburban life in New Jersey where nobody knew about her past unless she told them, and she never told anyone. Her husband knew vaguely that she'd been at the WTC on 9/11, had evacuated safely, but Sarah never told him the full story, never mentioned going back inside 7 times, never told him about the 300 people. Her children knew Mommy had been in New York during the attacks, but nothing more. Sarah's brother knew more but respected her wish not to discuss it. She wanted to be normal, to be just Sarah Thompson who worked in medical billing and drove her kids to soccer and lived a quiet life. She didn't want to be Sarah Thompson, the 9/11 hero, because that title came with 40 deaths attached to it. By 2024, 23 years after 9/11, Sarah was 44 years old and had mostly managed to build a life where she didn't think about that day every waking moment. The nightmares had decreased to maybe once a month. The panic attacks were rare. She could see images of the towers without completely breaking down. She'd reached a fragile equilibrium where the trauma was managed if not healed. Her brother's daughter, Sarah's niece Emma, was a huge Family Feud fan and begged Sarah to apply with the family. Sarah was reluctant, didn't like being on camera, didn't like attention, but Emma was persistent and Sarah loved her niece, so she agreed. They were selected to tape in September 2024, and Sarah went along thinking it would be a fun distraction, a silly game show, nothing serious. On the day of taping, September 6, 2024, Sarah stood with her brother's family trying to be present, trying to participate, pushing down the anxiety that always came with new situations and public exposure. Steve Harvey greeted them warmly, working his way down the line, and when he got to Sarah, he smiled kindly. "And you are?" Sarah returned the smile, trying to match his energy. "I'm Sarah Thompson. I work in medical billing." Steve nodded. "Medical billing, that's important work. Keeps the healthcare system running." Sarah appreciated that he'd made her boring job sound meaningful. The game began, and for the first 2 rounds Sarah participated minimally, let her brother and his family take the lead, content to be background. Then came the 3rd round, and Steve asked a question that would change everything. Name something a hero does that regular people wouldn't. It was a standard Family Feud question, meant to elicit answers like run into burning buildings, or save lives, or risk their safety. Sarah's nephew buzzed in first and said, "Save someone from drowning," which was on the board. They went down the line getting answers. Stop a robbery, pull someone from a car crash, standard heroic actions. Then it came to Sarah, and Steve said, "All right, Sarah, name something a hero does that regular people wouldn't." Sarah's mind went immediately to September 11th, to running back into the hotel while everyone else was running out, to searching room after room, to carrying people downstairs, to going back 7 times when every instinct screamed to run. And before she could stop herself, before she could filter or think or realize what she was revealing, Sarah said quietly, "Go back inside." When everyone else is evacuating, when you know you should leave, you go back inside because there might be someone who needs help. Her voice caught on the last words, and Steve noticed immediately that this wasn't a hypothetical answer. This was something personal, something real. Steve's face showed concern and curiosity. "That's very specific, Sarah. Is that something you've experienced?" The studio had gone quiet, everyone sensing something important was happening. Sarah opened her mouth to deflect, to say no, to laugh it off, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, tears started running down her face, and she heard herself saying, "I was at the World Trade Center on a 9/11. I was a hotel supervisor. I went back inside 7 times to evacuate guests while the towers were burning. I saved about 300 people, but 40 people from the hotel died, and I couldn't save them. And every time someone thanks me for being a hero, I think about the ones I couldn't reach." The silence in the studio was absolute, every person frozen in shock. Steve Harvey's mouth fell open, his face cycling through disbelief, awe, horror, and profound emotional devastation. He stood completely still, speechless, unable to form words, for over 30 seconds. Sarah kept talking, the dam broken after 23 years. "Everyone says I'm a hero, but heroes save everyone. I didn't save everyone. I got people out, but then the captain stopped me from going back inside, and maybe if I'd gone back one more time I could have saved one more person. So when you ask what heroes do, I know what they do. They go back inside when they're terrified. They keep searching when their body is screaming to run. They save as many as they can and then spend the rest of their lives thinking about the ones they didn't." Steve Harvey couldn't move, couldn't speak, stood frozen as tears ran down his face. The audience was sobbing, the crew was crying, Sarah's family was staring at her in shock, because most of them had never heard this story, never knew the full extent of what she'd done. Steve finally found his voice, shaking and broken. You saved 300 people on the 9/11. You went back inside the World Trade Center 7 times while the towers were falling, and you've never told anyone." Sarah shook her head, crying. "I didn't want to talk about it. Every time I tell someone, they call me a hero, and I can't be a hero when 40 people died. Do you understand? 300 people lived because of what I did, but 40 people died, and I remember all their names, and no amount of people thanking me will ever make up for the ones I couldn't save." Steve Harvey sat down on the stage floor, unable to stand, his hand over his heart, looking at Sarah like she was the most incredible and heartbreaking thing he'd ever witnessed. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Sarah, do you understand what you did? Do you understand that 300 families still have their mothers and fathers and children because of you? That 300 people got to go home that day because you risked your life 7 times. That you're the reason hundreds of people got to live the last 23 years. But Sarah shook her head violently. But 40 families don't have their loved ones. 40 people didn't get to go home. And maybe if I'd been faster, if I'd searched more rooms, if I'd convinced that fire captain to let me go back inside one more time. Steve cut her off, his voice fierce despite the tears. If you'd gone back inside one more time, you'd be dead. The South Tower collapsed at 9:59. If that captain hadn't stopped you, hadn't physically prevented you from going back in, you'd have been inside when the tower came down. You'd be one of the 40 instead of the person who saved 300. Sarah, you didn't fail anyone. You did something so brave, so selfless, so far beyond what anyone could have expected, that I don't even have words for it. He turned to the audience, his voice breaking. This woman, Sarah Thompson, on September 11, 2001, was 21 years old, working at a hotel at the World Trade Center. When the planes hit, when everyone was evacuating, she went back inside, not once, even TMS. She searched hundreds of rooms, carried people downstairs, evacuated approximately 300 guests while the building was on fire and the towers were collapsing around her. She risked her life repeatedly, and the only reason she's alive is because a fire captain physically prevented her from going back inside an 8th time. And for 23 years, she's carried guilt about the people she couldn't save, to the point where she's never told anyone, never claimed the title of hero, never accepted thanks or recognition. He looked back at Sarah, tears streaming down his face. You were 21 years old. 21. And you made a choice that should have killed you but instead saved 300 lives. How are you not proud of that? How do you carry 40 deaths instead of 300 lives? Sarah's voice was raw. Because the 40 have names. Because I can list them. Because if I'd done more, been better, those 40 people would still be alive, and their families wouldn't have spent 23 years grieving. She started naming them, the 40 people who died, reciting names she'd memorized from the casualty list. William Martinez, 42 years old, businessman from Texas. Jennifer Kim, 28 years old, tourist from California. Robert and Linda Schwartz, retired couple from Florida. Ahmed Hassan, 35 years old, conference attendee from Egypt. She got through about 15 names before Steve gently stopped her, recognizing that she'd memorized all 40, that she carried each death individually. Sarah, stop. Please stop. You know all their names. You've been carrying all 40 of them for 23 years. But do you know the names of the 300 people you saved? Sarah looked at him, confused. Some of them. The ones who've contacted me over the years. But not all of them. Steve's voice was gentle but firm. You know all the names of the people who died, but not all the names of the people who lived. That's trauma, Sarah. That's survivor's guilt. That's your brain focusing on what went wrong instead of what went right. But Sarah, 300 people are alive. They've lived 23 years they wouldn't have had. They've gotten married, had children, celebrated birthdays, pursued careers, experienced joy and love in life because you saved them. That's 300 lives, Sarah. That's not nothing. That's everything. Sarah collapsed, sobbing, her brother catching her, holding her while she broke down completely. Steve came over and knelt beside her, and he said something that would change Sarah's life. You're not responsible for the 40 who died. You're not. The terrorists who flew planes into buildings, they're responsible. The towers collapsing, structural failure and fire and the limits of what steel can withstand, that's responsible. But you, Sarah, you're responsible for 300 people living. That's your responsibility, that's your legacy. And you need to let yourself feel proud of that instead of guilty about what was impossible. The show stopped completely, producers making the decision that this was more important than Family Feud. Over the next hour, with Sarah's permission, they brought out several people via video call, survivors Sarah had personally evacuated on 9/11, who'd seen her name in the show's promotional materials and had reached out to producers. One by one, these people appeared on screens, speaking directly to Sarah, telling her how she'd saved their lives. A woman now in her 60s, who Sarah had carried down 6 flights of stairs when she'd been in a wheelchair. Sarah, I've thought about you every day for 23 years. You saved my life. I've gotten to meet my grandchildren because of you. I've gotten to grow old because of you. A man in his 50s who Sarah had found having a stroke. You dragged me down 5 flights of stairs. The doctors said if I'd been in that building 10 more minutes, I'd have died. You're the reason I'm alive, the reason my children still have a father. A couple with their adult son. You found us hiding in our hotel room. We were too scared to come out, thought it was safer to stay. You convinced us to follow you, and that decision saved our lives. Our son was 11 years old then. He's 34 now, married with children of his own. You gave us our family. 10 survivors spoke, representing the hundreds Sarah had saved, and each one told her variations of the same message: you saved us. We're alive because of you. Thank you. By the end, Sarah was sobbing so hard she couldn't speak, but something in her face had shifted, some of the weight she'd carried for 23 years starting to lift. The episode aired 3 weeks later, on September 11, 2024, the 23rd anniversary of the attacks. It was watched by over 500 million people globally within the first week, becoming the most watched Family Feud episode in history. Sarah's story went viral across every platform, with people around the world moved by this woman who'd saved 300 lives but carried guilt about 40 deaths, who'd hidden her heroism for over 2 decades, who'd only revealed the truth by accident during a game show. First responders from 9/11 reached out to Sarah, saying they understood survivors' guilt, that many of them carried the same weight about the people they couldn't save. Trauma therapists discussed Sarah's case as an example of how survivors often focus on perceived failures rather than actual successes, how the brain processes trauma by fixating on what went wrong. And survivors, hundreds of them, came forward publicly for the first time to thank Sarah Thompson, the front desk supervisor who'd saved their lives, and then disappeared into anonymity. The response was so overwhelming that Sarah had to hire someone to help manage it. She did interviews, telling her full story for the first time, working through her guilt publicly in a way that helped not just herself but other survivors dealing with similar trauma. She started speaking at first responder conferences, at PTSD treatment centers, at survivor support groups, talking about the weight of surviving when others don't, about carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you, about learning to accept that you did enough, even when it feels like you didn't do enough. 3 months after the episode aired, on December 11, 2024, Sarah attended a 9/11 memorial ceremony for the first time since 2001. She'd been invited dozens of times over the years but always declined, unable to face it. But this time she went, and she read the names of the 40 people from her hotel who died, honoring them publicly, acknowledging her grief and her guilt, but also, for the first time, acknowledging that she'd done everything she could. After she read the names, she added something that wasn't in the program. And to the approximately 300 people I helped evacuate that day, I want you to know that I think about you too. For 23 years I've been focused on the ones I couldn't save, but I'm learning to also honor the ones who lived. You lived. That matters. Your lives matter, and I'm grateful I was there to help you get out. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes carry burdens the rest of us can't imagine, and that survivors need to be thanked not just for what they did, but for continuing to live with what they experienced, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe to our channel because we need more stories like this, stories that acknowledge that trauma doesn't end when the crisis ends, that saving lives can destroy the person who does the saving, that survivor's guilt is real and profound and can last decades. Sarah Thompson was 21 years old on September 11, 2001. She went back inside a burning building 7 times while everyone else was evacuating. She searched hundreds of rooms, carried people downstairs, saved approximately 300 lives, while the World Trade Center collapsed around her. She should be celebrated as one of the great heroes of that day, but instead she spent 23 years hiding, carrying guilt about 40 people she couldn't save, refusing to accept thanks or recognition. When a simple Family Feud answer accidentally revealed what she'd done, when Steve Harvey stood speechless because the truth was too big to process, when survivors came forward to thank the woman who'd given them 23 more years of life, Sarah finally began to heal. Her story reminds us that the people who save lives aren't always the ones in uniform, that heroism looks like a 20 1-year-old front desk supervisor making the impossible choice to go back inside, that survivors carry weights we can't see, and that sometimes the most heroic thing of all is learning to forgive yourself for being human in an inhuman situation. That's what Sarah Thompson did during 12 Hours on September 11, 2001. And that's why her answer on Family Feud left Steve Harvey speechless and reminded all of us what real courage looks like.